This channel is for women who are doing fine, but feel quietly lost. The day I didn't answer, there was nothing dramatic about the moment everything began to change. No argument, no goodbye, no brave declaration whispered into the mirror. It started with a phone vibrating on a kitchen counter, and a choice so small it almost didn't register as a choice at all. I was standing there, barefoot, the light above the sink too bright for the hour, the day already heavy in my body. The phone buzzed once, then again. A familiar name, a familiar pattern. I knew what it would be before I picked it up. A question, a need, a pull on my attention that had nothing to do with how I was actually feeling. Normally, I would have answered immediately. I always did. Not because I wanted to, but because I didn't know how not to. Availability had become reflex. I'm like breathing, reach, respond, reassure, repeat. But that night, something in me stalled. Not anger, not defiance, just a quiet pause that felt almost dangerous. The kind of pause where you suddenly realize you've been moving nonstop for years, and stopping feels like stepping off a moving train. I stared at the phone. I felt the familiar rush rise in my chest. If I don't answer now, they'll think something's wrong. If I don't answer, I'll disappoint them. If I don't answer, I'm not being who they expect me to be. And underneath that rush, buried deeper than I was used to listening, there was another feeling, softer, older, tired. I didn't answer. The silence that followed was louder than the vibration ever was. It filled the kitchen, pressed against my ribs, crawled up into my throat. Guilt came fast, sharp, and efficient. It told me I was being selfish, that this wasn't how a good woman behaves, that love is proven by responsiveness, by being reachable, by never letting the line go quiet. I stood there anyway. Nothing happened. No emergency, no collapse, no angry follow-up. The world kept spinning with or without my immediate response, and that was the first thing that unsettled me. Not that something went wrong, but that nothing did. For the first time in a long time, my attention stayed with me. I noticed how tense my shoulders were, how shallow my breath had become, how my mind, so used to scanning for other people's needs, didn't quite know what to do when there was no one asking for it. The quiet wasn't peaceful yet. It was unfamiliar, almost threatening, like a room you haven't entered in years and don't quite trust anymore. And I realized then how much of my life had been organized around not letting silence exist. Silence meant space, and space meant questions I had avoided answering. Questions like, what do I want right now? What do I need? How tired am I, really? I had been so busy being present everywhere else that I had quietly abandoned myself. That night didn't feel empowering. It didn't feel strong. It felt awkward and wrong and tender in a way I wasn't used to. I wanted to grab the phone just to make the discomfort stop, to restore the familiar rhythm of being needed. But something held me back. Maybe it was exhaustion, finally outrunning obligation. Maybe it was the part of me that had been whispering for years and was tired of being ignored. All I know is that I let the moment pass. And in letting it pass, I crossed an invisible line. Because once you experience yourself not responding and surviving, you can't unlearn that truth. You can't unknow that the world does not end when you choose yourself for a moment. You can't unknow how much of your energy has been spent preemptively, automatically, without consent. That night, I didn't suddenly become unavailable to everyone. I didn't withdraw from life. I didn't turn cold or distant. I simply interrupted a pattern that had been running my life quietly in the background. The pattern of always being on call. The pattern of equating love with access. The pattern of believing that my worth was tied to how quickly I could be reached. I had been taught, explicitly and implicitly, that being available was a virtue, that a good woman answers, a reliable woman responds, a loving woman doesn't let the phone ring too long, doesn't let messages sit unread, doesn't choose herself when someone else is reaching out. So when I didn't answer, it felt like a small betrayal, not of them, but of the version of myself I had been performing for decades. And yet, in that betrayal, there was honesty. I wasn't unavailable because I didn't care. I was unavailable because I was empty. And for the first time, I let that be true without covering it up with politeness. That night taught me something no book, no conversation, no advice ever had. It taught me that my constant presence was not neutral. It was costing me something. It was costing me awareness, choice, energy, myself. I had always believed my power lived in how much I could hold, how much I could carry, how many people could lean on me without me breaking. I was wrong. My power had been waiting in the one place I was afraid to go, my absence, because absence reveals what presence hides. It shows you who panics when you step back. It shows you which connections depend on access rather than care. It shows you how much of your life has been built around being needed instead of being known. That first unanswered message didn't change my life overnight, but it cracked something open. It created a space where curiosity could enter, a space where I could begin asking myself a different kind of question. Not, who needs me right now? But what happens if I don't disappear for everyone else anymore? If this moment feels familiar to you, if you've ever felt that sharp guilt mixed with quiet relief when you didn't respond right away, then this story is for you. If you want to keep exploring these moments with me, and subscribe to the channel. Your support is what allows me to keep creating stories that sit in the quiet places most people avoid and say the things many women feel but rarely hear spoken out loud. Because when you stop being available, something begins and nothing stays the same. How availability became my identity. I didn't wake up one morning and decide to become endlessly available. There was no moment where I consciously chose it, no clear agreement I remember signing. It happened the way many things happen in a woman's life, slowly, quietly, disguised as virtue. It began with praise. You're so reliable. You always know what to say. I don't know what I'd do without you. Those words landed softly at first. They felt warm, affirming, like proof that I had found my place. When I was younger, being needed felt like safety. And it meant I mattered. It meant I was included. It meant I wasn't invisible. So I learned without anyone ever saying it directly that availability was a kind of currency. The more present I was, the more secure my position seemed. If I answered quickly, people stayed close. If I showed up without hesitation, doors stayed open. If I absorbed discomfort instead of causing it, things stayed calm. And calm felt like success. Over time, availability stopped being something I offered. It became something expected. And eventually, it became something I performed without checking in with myself first. I learned how to anticipate needs before they were spoken. I learned how to sense shifts in tone, pauses in messages, the subtle signs that someone was about to need more from me. I was praised for this intuition, for my empathy, for my steadiness. What no one noticed, and what I didn't fully understand myself, was that I was slowly training myself to exist in response to others, rather than in relationship with myself. I became the person people turned to because I never seemed to say no. Not the loud kind of no, anyway. I might sigh internally. I might rearrange my life quietly. I might feel resentment flicker and then bury it. But outwardly, I stayed agreeable, available, present. There is a particular role many women slip into without realizing it: the emotional infrastructure, the one who remembers, the one who holds space, the one who smooths things over so others don't have to sit with discomfort. That role is rarely assigned. It's absorbed. And once you're in it long enough, it becomes indistinguishable from who you think you are. I told myself this was just how I was built. That I was generous by nature. That I didn't mind. That I was strong enough to carry it. And for a long time, that story worked. It gave meaning to the fatigue. It turned depletion into purpose. But identity built on availability is fragile, because it only holds as long as you keep showing up. I didn't realize how tightly my sense of worth had wrapped itself around being needed until I imagined what would happen if I stopped. The fear wasn't that people would be angry. It was that they wouldn't know what to do with me anymore. That without my usefulness, I might become optional. That fear kept me in motion. As the years went on, the roles stacked. Professional responsibilities, family expectations, relationships that leaned heavily on my emotional steadiness. I became very good at being the one who could be counted on. And in a world that rewards productivity and composure, that skill is celebrated. No one asks how much it costs you. I didn't see myself as someone who lacked boundaries. I saw myself as flexible, easy, low maintenance. I told myself I was choosing harmony over conflict. What I didn't see was how often I chose harmony at my own expense. Availability had become a form of self-erasure disguised as kindness. I adjusted my schedule without question. I answered messages when I was tired. I made space for conversations I didn't have the energy for. I stayed reachable even when I needed quiet. And every time I did, I sent myself a subtle message. This matters more than you do. That message accumulates. Over time, I stopped checking what I felt before responding. I stopped noticing when something didn't sit right. I became fluent in override, in minimization, in telling myself it wasn't a big deal. That's the danger of making availability an identity. You lose access to your own signals. You don't just give your time, you give away your authority over it. There were moments, small, fleeting, when something in me resisted, a tightness, a fatigue that didn't make sense, a desire to be unreachable that I immediately dismissed as indulgent. I told myself rest could wait, that I could slow down later, that this was just a busy season. But seasons stretched into years, and I didn't notice how much of my inner life had gone quiet. I wasn't unhappy. That was the confusing part. I was functional, capable. I was doing everything that was expected of me. But somewhere along the way, I had stopped asking whether the life I was maintaining still fit me. Availability gave me structure, and it gave me identity. But it also kept me from asking deeper questions. Questions like, what do I want when no one is asking anything of me? What parts of me exist beyond service? Those questions felt dangerous, because I didn't know the answers. And so I stayed in the familiar role, the one that made sense to others, the one that came with approval, the one that felt easier than stepping into uncertainty. It's hard to let go of an identity that once protected you, even when it starts to suffocate you. I don't look back on that version of myself with anger. She did what she knew how to do. She learned early that being useful was a way to stay connected. She believed that being available was the same thing as being loving. But love that requires self-abandonment eventually turns into something else. It turns into obligation, and into quiet resentment, into exhaustion that doesn't have a clear source. The moment availability becomes who you are, absence feels like failure. And that is how you stay trapped. Not because anyone is forcing you to be there, but because you don't know who you would be if you weren't. Understanding this didn't happen all at once. It came slowly, through observation rather than confrontation, through noticing patterns instead of blaming people, through realizing that many of the expectations placed on me had only grown because I had reinforced them. I had taught people how to treat me by what I consistently allowed, and more importantly, I had taught myself that my worth was conditional. That realization wasn't empowering. It was sobering, because it meant the work ahead wasn't about setting boundaries with others, and it was about disentangling my identity from being constantly available, about learning who I was when I wasn't responding, fixing, or holding everything together. Availability had given me belonging, but it had also cost me myself, and once I saw that clearly, I couldn't unsee it. The exhaustion no one sees from the outside. Nothing looked wrong. That was the most disorienting part of it. I was functioning. I was meeting deadlines. I was showing up to work, to family gatherings, to conversations that required attention and emotional presence. I remembered birthdays. I answered emails. I handled logistics. I smiled when expected. If someone had asked how I was doing, I would have said, "I'm fine," and it wouldn't have been a lie. It just wouldn't have been the whole truth. The exhaustion I carried didn't announce itself, and it didn't knock me down or force me to stop. It settled in quietly, like background noise you only notice when the room finally goes silent. I didn't feel dramatic burnout. I felt dulled, flattened, as if the sharp edges of my inner life had been slowly sanded down. I slept, but I didn't feel restored. I took breaks, but they didn't refill anything. I could take a vacation and come back just as tired as when I left, because the tiredness wasn't coming from how much I was doing. It was coming from how much of myself I was constantly giving away in small, invisible increments. There is a kind of exhaustion that doesn't live in the muscles. It lives in attention. My attention was always partially elsewhere. Even when I was technically alone, my mind was scanning, waiting, anticipating the next message, the next request, and the next emotional shift that would require a response. I lived in a state of readiness that never shut off, not panic, not anxiety in the obvious sense, just a low-level vigilance that became so familiar, I stopped noticing it. Every notification carried a decision. Do I respond now or later? How do I phrase this so it doesn't create tension? How much of myself do I offer here? Those decisions were rarely conscious. They happened quickly, automatically, but each one cost something. Decision fatigue doesn't feel like indecision. It feels like numbness, like moving through the day on autopilot, like choosing the path of least resistance, not because it's right, but because it's easier than thinking. I didn't realize how fragmented my presence had become. I could be in a conversation and already thinking about the next one. I could be listening while mentally composing a response to something else entirely. I was everywhere and nowhere at the same time. That fragmentation is exhausting in a way that's hard to explain to someone who hasn't lived it. It's not about being busy. It's about being permeable, about having no clear boundary between what belongs to you and what belongs to everyone else. I had trained myself to absorb emotions, expectations, tension. Other people's urgency became my urgency. Other people's discomfort became something I felt responsible for smoothing out. Over time, my nervous system never fully rested, even when my body did. What made it harder was that there was no obvious villain, no single relationship or situation I could point to and say, "This is what's draining me." It was cumulative, 1,000 small moments of being reachable, and 1,000 small choices to respond instead of pause. Because it was invisible, I doubted it. I told myself I was being dramatic, that everyone feels tired, that this was just adulthood, midlife, responsibility. I compared myself to people who were clearly struggling and told myself I had no right to feel depleted. So I pushed through, and the pushing became its own kind of prison. I noticed the signs before I understood them. I felt irritated by small interruptions. I felt resentful without knowing why. I felt disconnected from things that used to bring me quiet pleasure. I would sit down to read and find myself rereading the same paragraph over and over, unable to settle into it. My inner world felt cluttered, not with thoughts exactly, but with unfinished threads, conversations I hadn't processed, requests I hadn't declined, an emotional weight I hadn't acknowledged because there hadn't been space to. The exhaustion showed up as impatience with myself, as a constant sense of being behind, even when there was nothing specific I was late for, as a vague sadness that didn't attach itself to any one event. I didn't know how to rest properly because rest, for me, had always been conditional. I rested once everything was handled, everyone was okay, every loose end was tied. But there was always another message, another need, another small thing that required my attention. So rest never came clean. It was interrupted, shallow, temporary. The truth I didn't want to face was this. I wasn't tired because I was weak. I was tired because I had made myself endlessly accessible to too many things that didn't actually require my involvement. Accessibility is not neutral, and it shapes your internal landscape. When you are constantly reachable, your inner life becomes secondary by default. There is no space for boredom, reflection, or emotional digestion. Everything is immediate. Everything demands response. I had been living in reaction mode for so long that I forgot what it felt like to move from intention. That kind of living slowly drains meaning out of even good things. It turns connection into obligation. It turns generosity into depletion. It turns presence into performance. And because I was still functioning, no one noticed. I didn't look burned out. I looked capable. I looked composed. I looked like someone who had it together. Even I believed that for a long time, until I noticed how little of myself was actually present in my own life. I realized I couldn't remember the last time I had done something without also being available to interruption. I couldn't remember the last time my attention had fully belonged to me. The exhaustion wasn't asking me to stop working. It was asking me to stop leaking energy in directions I never chose consciously. This kind of tiredness doesn't demand dramatic change. It asks for something quieter and harder: discernment, selectivity, the willingness to notice what drains you even when it looks harmless on the surface. I didn't need more rest. I needed fewer points of entry into my inner world. I needed to understand that being reachable at all times had trained my system to stay open when it needed containment. That my fatigue wasn't a personal failure, but a predictable response to a life lived without enough internal privacy. Once I saw that, the exhaustion made sense. It wasn't something to fix quickly or push past. It was information, a signal that something in the way I was living needed to change. Not dramatically, not all at once, but intentionally. I wasn't broken. I was overexposed. And my body, my mind, my spirit were all quietly asking for the same thing: less access, more integrity, a chance to gather myself back together again. The first boundary felt like betrayal. The first boundary I set didn't feel empowering. It didn't feel brave or self-respecting or clean. It felt wrong in my body, like I had violated an unspoken contract I had spent a lifetime honoring. It was small, almost forgettable. I didn't raise my voice or draw a line in the sand. I didn't explain myself or prepare a speech. I simply said, "I can't tonight." The words were calm, even gentle, but the moment they left my mouth, something inside me tightened. It wasn't fear of the other person's reaction. It was fear of my own. I waited for the familiar wave of relief that usually followed compliance. It didn't come. Instead, there was a sharp, internal backlash, a voice that sounded suspiciously like responsibility, morality, and goodness all tangled together. You're being selfish. You're disappointing someone. This isn't who you are. You're changing, and not in a good way. That voice was convincing because it had been rehearsed for decades. I had learned early on that discomfort in others was something to manage. If someone felt let down, it meant I had failed. If someone was unhappy, it was my cue to adjust. Boundaries, in that framework, weren't neutral. They were personal offenses, evidence of hardness, proof of withdrawal. So when I finally said no, my body reacted as if I had done something cruel. I noticed how quickly I wanted to fix it, to follow up with an explanation, to soften the refusal with reassurance, to promise I would make it up later. That impulse was automatic. It came from years of learning that a boundary was only acceptable if it came wrapped in apology. I didn't apologize, and that was when the discomfort deepened. I sat with it, uncertain, almost embarrassed by how hard it felt to do something so simple. I told myself I was overreacting, that everyone says no sometimes. But the truth was, I wasn't reacting to the boundary itself. I was reacting to what the boundary threatened. It threatened an identity built on accommodation. I had believed that being good meant being flexible, that being kind meant being available, and that being loved meant being easy to reach, easy to lean on, easy to ask from. So when I didn't bend, even slightly, it felt like betrayal, not of them, but of the role I had played so well for so long. The hardest part wasn't the external response, it was the internal reckoning, the realization that I had been equating my worth with how little friction I caused, that I had been measuring my goodness by how much of myself I was willing to set aside. This first boundary forced me to see something I had avoided. I had been confusing self-erasure with generosity. The guilt lingered longer than I expected. It didn't pass once the moment was over. It followed me into the evening, into my thoughts, into the quiet spaces where I usually dissolved myself into distraction. I kept replaying the interaction, scanning for signs that I had done damage, and that I had created distance, that I had crossed a line. What unsettled me most was that nothing catastrophic had happened. The person I said no to didn't fall apart. The relationship didn't implode. The earth didn't tilt on its axis. The only thing that felt broken was my internal sense of order. I realized then how deeply I had internalized the idea that my job was to prevent discomfort at all costs, especially discomfort directed at me. I had learned to read disappointment as danger, to read tension as failure, to read boundaries as abandonment. So of course the first one hurt. It exposed how much of my life had been organized around avoiding that feeling. I began to see that this wasn't about a single boundary. It was about an entire nervous system trained to prioritize external harmony over internal truth. Saying no disrupted that system. It forced me to sit with sensations I had spent years smoothing over: anxiety, guilt, uncertainty, the fear of being misunderstood. There was a moment, late that night, when I almost reversed it. I almost reached out to explain, to restore the familiar equilibrium. I wanted the discomfort to end. But something else was happening beneath the surface. I was beginning to sense the difference between discomfort that signals harm and discomfort that signals growth. This wasn't the sharp pain of doing something against my values. It was the dull ache of stepping out of alignment with a pattern that had long stopped serving me. That distinction mattered. For the first time, I questioned the assumption that feeling bad meant I had done something wrong. What if the guilt wasn't evidence of selfishness, and but evidence of conditioning? What if the discomfort was simply the nervous system adjusting to a new boundary of reality? That thought didn't make the feeling disappear, but it gave it context. I started paying attention to how quickly I judged myself for choosing rest, for choosing space, for choosing not to perform emotional availability on demand. The judgment wasn't neutral. It was inherited, learned, reinforced by years of being praised for my endurance, my flexibility, my willingness to show up no matter what. Boundaries disrupt approval. That is why they feel dangerous. They remove the guarantee that you will be liked for being easy. They replace it with something less predictable: respect, distance, recalibration. And for someone who has relied on approval as a form of safety, that shift is terrifying. The first boundary forced me to grieve something I hadn't realized I was losing: the illusion that I could be endlessly giving without cost, the belief that I could remain the same version of myself forever and still feel whole. I didn't suddenly feel strong after that moment. I felt exposed. I felt unsure. I felt like I had stepped into a room without knowing the rules. But there was also a strange clarity. For the first time, I could see how often I had said yes when I meant no, simply to preserve an image. How many times I had overridden my own limits to maintain consistency. How often I had equated reliability with self-sacrifice. The boundary didn't change my relationships overnight. It changed my awareness. I began to notice the subtle ways I had been betraying myself long before I ever risked betraying anyone else. And I saw how frequently I had prioritized being perceived as kind over actually being honest. How often I had chosen the familiar discomfort of overextension over the unfamiliar discomfort of self-respect. That first boundary didn't teach me how to say no with confidence. It taught me how deeply unpracticed I was at letting myself be inconvenient, and that knowledge stayed with me. Because once you recognize that the pain you feel after setting a boundary is not proof of wrongdoing, but proof of transformation, you can no longer unsee it. You begin to understand that betrayal is not always what it appears to be. Sometimes, the betrayal isn't the moment you say no. It's all the moments before that, when you said yes and disappeared a little each time. That first boundary didn't make me selfish. It made me honest. And honesty, I was learning, doesn't always feel kind at first. Who panicked when I pulled back? When I pulled back, I didn't announce it. I didn't gather people around a table or explain my intentions. I didn't say I was changing or ask anyone to understand. I simply became less available, fewer immediate replies, less emotional urgency, more pauses where there used to be instant presence, and that was when everything revealed itself. Not all at once, not dramatically, but unmistakably. Some people barely noticed, or if they did, they adjusted without comment. Conversations continued, just with more space between them. Plans shifted naturally. There was no tension, no interrogation, no sense of loss. These relationships breathed on their own. They didn't depend on my constant attention to stay alive. Others reacted differently. I felt it first as pressure, a subtle at the beginning, a slightly sharper tone, a follow-up message sent sooner than usual, a hint of irritation disguised as concern. "Are you okay? You seem distant. Everything all right?" On the surface it sounded caring, but underneath there was something else. Discomfort, unease, a disruption of expectation. I hadn't realized how predictable I had been until I stopped being so. There were people who had grown used to my immediacy, my emotional availability, my willingness to step in without being asked. When that rhythm changed, they felt unbalanced. not because I had wronged them, but because the dynamic had shifted. I watched closely. I didn't accuse. I didn't defend myself. I observed. Who respected the pause without needing an explanation? Who waited without resentment? Who stayed present even when I wasn't filling every gap? And then there were those who panicked. Their reactions weren't loud. Panic rarely is. It shows up as guilt, as subtle blame, as confusion that quickly turns into accusation. You've changed. You're not like you used to be. You're being distant. What they meant was, you're no longer functioning the way I'm used to. That realization was painful, not because it made them villains, but because it made something undeniable. Some connections were built on access, not intimacy, on utility, not mutual presence. I had been the constant in many people's lives, the one who answered, the one who listened, the one who absorbed emotional overflow without complaint. When I stepped back, it created a vacuum they didn't know how to handle. And instead of asking what I needed, some tried to pull me back into place. And I noticed how quickly concern turned into irritation, how understanding evaporated when it required patience, how my absence was framed as a problem rather than a reality. That was the moment I understood something crucial. Not everyone misses you when you're gone. Some miss what you provided. That distinction hurt more than I expected, because for years I had believed these connections were reciprocal, that my presence mattered because of who I was, not just because of what I did. But when my availability decreased, the imbalance became visible. There were people who didn't reach out to ask how I was. They reached out to restore the old dynamic, to reestablish access, to make sure the resource was still there. Others surprised me. They noticed the change and responded with care rather than demand. They asked if I was okay without making it about themselves. They didn't pressure me to return to who I was. They met me where I was. These interactions felt different in my body, calmer, safer, less transactional. I began to understand that the measure of a relationship isn't how much someone needs you when you're available. It's how they treat you when you're not. Pulling back acted like a filter, not an aggressive one, a quiet one. It filtered out dependency disguised as closeness. It revealed which connections relied on my overextension to function. It showed me who was comfortable with my humanity and who preferred my usefulness. This wasn't about blaming anyone. Many of these dynamics formed unconsciously. I had taught people what to expect from me by consistently overriding my own limits. When I stopped doing that, I find it challenged the roles we had settled into. Change exposes comfort. I felt grief for the relationships that shifted, even the ones that hadn't been healthy. Loss doesn't only hurt when it's unjust. It hurts when it's familiar. When you realize that something you invested in was sustained by imbalance, not care, there were moments when I questioned myself, when I wondered if I was being unfair, if I was abandoning people who relied on me. That guilt ran deep because I had spent so long equating support with sacrifice. But then I asked myself a harder question. Who was supporting me? When I looked honestly, the answer was uncomfortable. Some of the people most distressed by my absence had never been particularly present for me when I was struggling. They were accustomed to leaning, not to standing beside. That clarity didn't come with triumph. It came with sadness and relief. Because once you see the difference between mutual connection and quiet extraction, you can't unsee it. You start to notice patterns you once rationalized, conversations that only happened when something was needed, check-ins that disappeared when you weren't available to give. I realized how often I had confused longevity with depth. Just because a relationship had lasted a long time didn't mean it had been balanced. It simply meant I had been consistent. Pulling back disrupted that consistency. Some people drifted away without confrontation. No fight, no closure. Just a gradual fading once they realized I was no longer a reliable source of emotional labor. That loss felt sharp at first, but it also felt honest. Others tried harder to pull me back. They questioned my motives. They framed my boundaries as personal rejection. They spoke as if my availability belonged to them, as if my absence required justification. I didn't explain. That was part of the learning. I began to understand that when someone reacts strongly to a boundary that was set quietly and respectfully, the reaction is rarely about the boundary itself. It's about what the boundary threatens. For some, it threatened comfort. For others, control. For a few, it threatened an identity built around being the one who could always rely on me. And that was not my responsibility to manage. As I stayed with this new distance, something inside me settled. I felt less pulled, less fragmented, less responsible for maintaining dynamics that no longer felt aligned. I also felt more discerning. When I started to differentiate between people who wanted connection and people who wanted access, between those who could hold space for me and those who only knew how to take up space. This discernment wasn't harsh. It was quiet. It didn't require confrontation or labeling. It simply required honesty. Pulling back didn't make me colder. It made me clearer. I stopped trying to be everything to everyone. I stopped filling silence just to avoid discomfort. I allowed people to reveal how they related to me when I wasn't performing availability. And in that space, I learned something essential. The relationships that survived my absence weren't weaker. They were real. And the ones that fell away weren't taken from me. They were returned to where they belonged. Silence changed. The power dynamic. Silence entered my life not as a strategy, but as a consequence. I didn't decide to wield it. I arrived there because I ran out of explanations, out of energy, out of the desire to keep translating myself into versions that felt more acceptable to others. For most of my life, I believed that clarity required words, that if I could just explain myself well enough, kindly enough, patiently enough, things would settle, misunderstandings would dissolve, tension would soften. People would see my intentions and meet me there. So I explained, constantly. I explained why I couldn't make it, why I needed space, why something hurt, why I was tired, why I felt differently than expected. I wrapped every boundary in context, empathy, reassurance. I tried to manage not only my choices but other people's reactions to them. What I didn't realize was that every explanation kept me inside the dynamic I was trying to step out of. As long as I was explaining, I was still negotiating. As long as I was defending myself, I was still asking for permission. As long as I was filling the silence, I was still carrying the emotional weight of the situation. The shift happened slowly. I began to notice how certain conversations never ended, no matter how carefully I chose my words. How some people weren't actually listening, only waiting for their turn to respond. How my explanations were sometimes used against me later, quoted back in ways that distorted what I meant. I started to feel exposed after talking, drained, like I had handed over pieces of myself that weren't handled with care. And one day, without planning it, I stopped. Someone questioned a choice I made. Normally, I would have rushed to soften it, to clarify, to reassure. Instead, I paused. I felt the familiar urge to fill the space rise up, but I didn't act on it. I said nothing. The silence felt heavy at first, not peaceful, charged, like a held breath. I worried it would be read as coldness, as arrogance, as indifference. I worried about being misunderstood. But something unexpected happened. The conversation shifted. Without my words to guide it, the other person began filling the space themselves. They talked more, assumed more, revealed more. And I realized something that unsettled me deeply. As long as I was speaking, I had been shaping the narrative in ways that protected them from seeing themselves. Silence removed that protection. When I stopped explaining, the power dynamic changed. Not because I gained power over anyone, but because I stopped giving mine away. Silence interrupted patterns that depended on my participation. It broke cycles that only existed because I kept responding. It created a pause where there used to be automatic engagement. I began to understand that not every misunderstanding needs correction. Not every assumption deserves response. Not every opinion about me requires my involvement. That understanding didn't make me detached. It made me discerning. There is a difference between silence that comes from fear and silence that comes from clarity. I had spent years afraid of what would happen if I didn't speak, afraid that I would lose connection, afraid that I would be erased. But silence didn't erase me. It revealed me. I noticed how some people grew uncomfortable when I didn't immediately respond, and they mistook my quiet for withdrawal, for punishment, for a power move. In truth, it was none of those things. It was simply me no longer performing emotional labor on demand. Silence forced others to confront their own discomfort, and many didn't like that. I also noticed how my body responded to silence. My breath slowed. My shoulders dropped. My mind felt less cluttered. I slept better on days when I didn't over-explain. I carried fewer conversations around in my head at night, replaying what I should have said differently. Silence gave me back my energy. For the first time, I experienced what it felt like to respond instead of react, to choose engagement rather than default to it, to let things unfold without my constant intervention. That kind of restraint was unfamiliar. It felt exposed at times, vulnerable, and there were moments when I worried that my quiet would be misinterpreted as indifference. But I began to see that people who needed constant reassurance were rarely reassured anyway, and people who respected me didn't need constant explanation. Silence also clarified my own thoughts. When I stopped talking so much, I started listening to myself. I noticed when something felt off sooner. I recognized misalignment before it turned into resentment. I trusted my internal signals instead of overriding them for the sake of keeping things smooth. I learned that silence isn't the absence of communication. It's a form of communication that doesn't require translation. It says, I know what I believe. I know what I've chosen. I don't need to convince you. That realization was unsettling because it meant letting go of control, letting go of the illusion that if I just said the right thing, I could manage how I was perceived. Silence doesn't give you that control. What it gives you instead is integrity. I began to notice how often words had been used as currency, as bargaining chips, as tools to maintain access. Silence removed those tools from the table, and without them, dynamics either recalibrated or collapsed. Some relationships grew quieter but stronger. There was less noise, less performance, more presence. Others faded because they couldn't survive without constant engagement. That wasn't something I forced. It was something I allowed. Silence also taught me patience. It showed me that time reveals what arguments never can. That when I stopped defending myself, the truth had space to surface on its own. People eventually saw what they were ready to see, and without my interference. And if they didn't, I learned to live with that. That was perhaps the hardest part. Accepting that being understood by everyone is not a requirement for living truthfully. accepting that some people will project their own stories onto your silence, and that correcting them is not your job. The world is loud. Everyone is speaking, reacting, explaining, proving. Silence stands out not because it's aggressive, but because it's rare. And in that rarity, it holds weight. I stopped measuring my worth by how articulate I could be under pressure. I stopped exhausting myself trying to make others comfortable with choices they were never going to agree with anyway. Silence became a form of self-respect, not a wall, a boundary that didn't need defending. It allowed me to conserve my energy for conversations that mattered, for people who listened, for moments that felt aligned. It kept me from bleeding out my attention into places where it was never going to be received with care. I didn't become cold, I became precise. And in that precision, I found something I hadn't known I was missing. Peace. Not the fragile peace that depends on everyone else's approval, but the steady peace that comes from no longer betraying yourself in the name of being understood. Silence changed the power dynamic because it returned something to me that I had given away too freely for too long, my center. And once I learned how to stay there, I no longer needed to explain why. Time came back to me. Time didn't rush back into my life all at once. It didn't announce itself or arrive with dramatic relief. It came quietly, almost cautiously, on as if unsure whether it was truly welcome after so many years of being dismissed. At first, I barely noticed it. A few unscheduled minutes here, a stretch of silence there. But slowly, unmistakably, something began to shift. I wasn't just less busy, I was less owned. For a long time, my days hadn't really belonged to me. They were parceled out in advance, sliced into obligations and expectations, filled with other people's timelines and urgencies. Even when my calendar looked manageable, my mind was crowded. I lived as if my time were provisional, always subject to interruption, always waiting to be claimed by someone else's needs. When I stopped being constantly available, that dynamic loosened, and with it, time began to reappear, not as empty space to be filled, but as something solid, almost physical. I could feel it again. The first thing I noticed was how uncomfortable it felt. Stillness had become unfamiliar. An open hour felt suspicious, like I had forgotten something important. I caught myself reaching for my phone out of habit, not because I needed it, but because I didn't know what to do with the quiet. I had trained myself to equate motion with value. If I wasn't responding, producing, or tending to something, I felt vaguely irresponsible. But then I stayed with it. I let a morning unfold without rushing it. I made coffee without multitasking. I stood by the window longer than necessary, watching the light shift across the floor. Nothing profound happened, and that was the point. There was no outcome to justify the moment. It existed on its own. That was new. For years, time had only felt legitimate if it was being used for something or someone else. Even rest had to be earned, squeezed in after everything else was taken care of. And everything else was never fully taken care of. There was always another message, another task, another emotional thread tugging at my attention. But when I stopped answering everything immediately, time stopped being stolen in fragments. It gathered itself back into whole moments, moments that didn't belong to anyone but me. I began to notice mornings differently, the way my body felt before the day demanded anything from it, the quiet clarity that existed before the noise of expectations set in. I realized how rarely I had allowed myself to inhabit that space, how often I had sacrificed it to urgency that wasn't actually urgent. Time, I learned, isn't just measured in hours, it's measured in presence. When I was constantly available, and my presence was diluted. I was half here, half elsewhere, always anticipating the next interruption. But with fewer points of access into my day, my attention settled. I could read without checking the clock. I could walk without feeling pulled. I could sit without narrating my own productivity. This wasn't about doing less. It was about doing things without being fragmented by everything else. I also started to see how much time I had been spending on responsibilities that weren't mine, emotional emergencies that I had volunteered to manage, problems I had absorbed simply because I was capable. I had confused helpfulness with obligation, and obligation had quietly taken over my life. When I stepped back, I realized how often I had said yes to things that didn't actually require me, things that could have been handled by someone else, or not handled at all. My availability had made it easy for others to offload their discomfort onto me. Without that constant access, they adapted, or they didn't. Either way, time was returned to me. There was grief in that realization, a sense of how much of my life had been lived in reaction rather than intention. But there was also relief, because I could finally see where my time had gone and how to reclaim it. I began to protect certain hours without explanation. Early mornings, evenings after a long day, weekends that didn't need to be optimized. At first I felt guilty. I worried I was being indulgent, selfish, irresponsible. But the guilt softened as I noticed what these protected spaces gave back to me. I felt less rushed, less brittle, less resentful. Time stopped feeling like something that was always slipping through my fingers. It became something I could hold. With that came a subtle shift in how I made decisions. I started asking different questions. Not, can I fit this in, but do I want my time to go here? Not, will this upset someone, but will this leave me depleted? Those questions weren't dramatic. They didn't lead to sweeping changes overnight, but they introduced intention where there had once been default compliance. I also noticed how time affected my sense of self. When I wasn't constantly reacting, I could hear my own thoughts again, not the loud, anxious ones, but the quieter ones that had been drowned out by constant engagement. Ideas surfaced. Desires reappeared. Things I had once loved but quietly set aside began to matter again. I remembered what it felt like to move at my own pace. That pace didn't match everyone else's, and it didn't need to. I stopped trying to synchronize my life with other people's urgency. I allowed my rhythm to be my own, even when it looked slower from the outside. Slower, I realized, doesn't mean stagnant. It means deliberate. Time also deepened my relationships, because when I chose to give it, I was actually present. I wasn't half listening, half thinking about what else needed my attention. My conversations became fewer, but richer. My presence became something I offered intentionally, not something that could be assumed. People noticed, some adjusted, some didn't. But the way they related to my time changed, because the way I treated it had changed first. I stopped apologizing for not being available, and I stopped explaining why I needed space. I simply lived within the boundaries I had set, and over time, they became normal. What surprised me most was how life seemed to expand inside the same number of hours. Not because I was more efficient, but because I was more aligned. Ordinary moments took on weight. A quiet afternoon felt nourishing instead of empty. Doing nothing stopped feeling like a failure. Time returning to me wasn't about escape. It was about presence, about reclaiming the right to exist without justification. I had spent so long believing my time was valuable only insofar as it served others. Now I was learning that my time was my life, and like my life, it deserved care, protection, and intention. When time came back to me, I didn't suddenly know exactly how to use it. But I knew this much. It was no longer something I was willing to give away without consent. And in that knowing, something essential returned as well: myself. My energy felt different. The change in my energy didn't arrive the way I expected it to. I had imagined something obvious, something dramatic, waking up one morning suddenly lighter, clearer, renewed. That wasn't how it happened. What changed was quieter and far more unsettling in its subtlety. My energy didn't surge, it recalibrated. I noticed it first in my body, not as strength, but as softness. My shoulders didn't live permanently near my ears anymore. My jaw unclenched without me having to remind it to. I wasn't bracing myself for interruption in the same way. I moved through my days with less internal resistance, felt less of that constant sense of being pulled in too many directions at once. For years, I had mistaken adrenaline for vitality. The low hum of urgency had become my baseline, and I thought that was what being alive felt like. When that hum quieted, I worried something was wrong. But what was actually happening was that my system was no longer leaking energy in 1,000 small ways. When I stopped being constantly available, my energy stopped scattering. It became contained. I could feel the difference in how I entered conversations. I wasn't rushing to fill space or anticipate what the other person needed. I listened more slowly. I spoke less. And when I did speak, my words felt rooted instead of reactive. There was less effort in them, less need to manage how they landed. This wasn't detachment, it was presence. And I also noticed that I was more selective without being calculating. I didn't sit around making lists of who deserved my energy. I simply paid attention to how I felt before and after interactions. Some exchanges left me steady, even nourished. Others left a faint drain, a sense of contraction I had learned to ignore in the past. Now I didn't ignore it. That awareness changed everything. Energy, I began to understand, is not just something you have. It's something you give permission to move. And for a long time I had been granting access indiscriminately, not because people demanded it, but because I didn't know how to withhold without guilt. As that guilt loosened, my energy stopped being something I had to ration through exhaustion. It became something I could choose where to place. I found myself saying no with less internal debate, not because I was hardened, but because I could feel the cost of certain yeses more clearly. Some commitments asked more than they gave. Some conversations required emotional labor I was no longer willing to provide on autopilot. This selectivity wasn't about control, it was about alignment. I also noticed that when I did say yes, it felt different. There was no undercurrent of resentment, no quiet tallying of what I was giving up. I showed up fully, without the sense that I was borrowing from tomorrow's reserves. My presence carried more weight, because it wasn't diluted by overextension. People responded to this shift, even when they couldn't name it. I could see it in the way they listened, in the way they paused before making requests, in the way they seemed more attuned to my boundaries. Not everyone, but enough to notice. An energy speaks before words do. I realized that much of what I had called kindness in the past was actually self-neglect. I had been generous with my energy because I didn't know how to be generous with myself. As that changed, the quality of my giving changed too. It became cleaner, less tangled, more honest. There was also a new clarity in my perception. I could sense misalignment earlier, before it turned into frustration or withdrawal. I noticed when something felt off without needing to rationalize it. I trusted those sensations instead of overriding them for the sake of being agreeable. This wasn't intuition as mysticism. It was intuition as information. My energy became a kind of compass. It told me when to lean in and when to step back, when to engage and when to rest, when to speak and when silence was the more respectful choice. When, as my energy stabilized, I stopped feeling addicted to exhaustion. I no longer wore busyness as proof of importance. I didn't equate depletion with dedication. I began to see how deeply I had internalized the idea that being tired meant being valuable. Letting go of that belief felt like stepping out of a costume I had worn for so long I forgot it wasn't my skin. There was also an unexpected return of joy. Not the loud, celebratory kind, but small, grounded moments of aliveness. I noticed the way light shifted in a room. I caught myself smiling without effort. Ideas surfaced without being forced. Creativity returned in quiet ways, not as ambition, but as curiosity. This energy wasn't restless. It didn't demand to be used immediately. It felt patient, available without being consumed. And I began to understand that energy doesn't come from doing less or doing more. It comes from doing what feeds you and releasing what drains you. I could work hard and still feel whole if the work aligned with me. I could be busy and still feel calm if my busyness wasn't built on obligation. What drained me wasn't effort. It was misalignment. As my energy shifted, so did my relationship with others. I no longer showed up half-present, distracted by the feeling that I was running on empty. When I listened, I listened. When I gave freely. And because of that, my relationships felt less heavy. Resentment, which I hadn't even realized I was carrying, began to dissolve. Before, every request felt like a small burden, even when I agreed to it. Now, because I wasn't overextended, I could offer my time without that quiet inner protest. That change alone felt like a form of freedom. I also became more protective of my energy. Without becoming defensive, I didn't need to explain why I was unavailable. I didn't need to justify my choices. I simply honored the signals my body and mind were giving me. This protection wasn't rigid. It was responsive. And in that responsiveness, my energy became magnetic in a way I hadn't experienced before. Not because I was trying to attract anything, but because I was no longer leaking myself away. People could feel the difference. I could feel it too. I stopped blending into the background of my own life. I stopped moving through my days like I was bracing for impact. I occupied my own space more fully, without apology. This wasn't about becoming untouchable. It was about becoming intentional. With my energy restored, I felt capable again, not in the sense of doing more, but in the sense of being more present, more alive, more myself. I didn't need to prove anything. I didn't need to hustle for worth. I was no longer living on the scraps of my own attention. I was living from the whole. And from that place, everything I touched began to feel different, not louder, not faster, but truer. I stopped chasing being chosen. I didn't realize how much of my life had been shaped by the quiet hope of being chosen until I stopped chasing it. There was no single moment of awakening, no dramatic rejection that forced clarity. It was subtler than that. It came from noticing how often my decisions were influenced by the question I rarely admitted to myself: will this make me more acceptable? For years, and I had lived as though my place in other people's lives was provisional, as if it had to be earned again and again through patience, flexibility, understanding. I told myself I wasn't seeking approval, that I was simply considerate. But underneath that story was a deeper pattern. I was adjusting myself in small ways, constantly, to secure belonging. I softened my needs before they could inconvenience anyone. I delayed my truth until the timing felt safer. I stayed longer than I should have in situations that felt thin or misaligned, hoping that if I was consistent enough, generous enough, I would eventually be met with the same care I was offering. This wasn't desperation in the obvious sense. It was quieter, more respectable. It wore the face of maturity and compromise. but it carried the same hunger underneath, the desire to be selected, affirmed, kept. I didn't see how much energy this cost me, how much of my attention went toward monitoring reactions, reading rooms, sensing shifts in tone. I was constantly calibrating myself, asking not what felt true, but what would be received best. The shift began when I stopped confusing interest with alignment. I noticed how often I was drawn to situations where my value felt uncertain, where affection came in waves, where consistency was intermittent. I told myself this was normal. That connection required effort. That depth came from enduring ambiguity. But ambiguity, I was learning, is not depth. It's often avoidance dressed up as mystery. When I stopped being constantly available, I also stopped chasing signals. I stopped trying to decode silence, interpret delays, or prove my worth through patience. And I let things unfold without chasing after them. At first, this felt like giving up, like surrendering my influence. I worried that if I didn't reach out, I would be forgotten, that if I didn't try harder, I would lose opportunities, relationships, connection. Some of that happened, and what surprised me was how little it hurt compared to how much it relieved me. Because in stepping back, I saw something clearly for the first time. Anything that required me to abandon myself to be chosen was never a true choice in the first place. I began to ask different questions. Not, how can I be more appealing? But, how do I feel here? Not, what do they want from me? But what do I want from this? These questions didn't make me more confident overnight. They made me more honest, and honesty changed the landscape. I stopped pursuing people who responded inconsistently. I stopped waiting for clarity from those who benefited from my uncertainty. I stopped investing in situations that required me to be smaller, quieter, or endlessly patient in order to be tolerated. This wasn't about pride. It wasn't about deciding I was above anyone else. It was about recognizing that my energy, my presence, my care were not meant to be offered in exchange for scraps of attention. I realized how often I had mistaken effort for compatibility, how much I had romanticized the struggle of being chosen instead of noticing how peaceful it felt to be met. When I stopped chasing, something unexpected happened. I didn't feel empty. I felt steadier. The anxiety that came from waiting to hear back, waiting to be included, and waiting to be prioritized, began to loosen its grip. I no longer felt the need to position myself strategically in other people's lives. I didn't need to be indispensable. I didn't need to be impressive. I didn't need to audition. That was when rejection began to feel different. It no longer landed as a verdict on my worth. It felt like information, like a signal pointing me away from what wasn't aligned. I could feel disappointment without collapsing into self-doubt. I could feel sadness without turning it inward, as proof that something was wrong with me. This shift didn't make me immune to longing. I still wanted connection. I still valued intimacy. But I no longer believed that wanting something meant I had to chase it. I learned to sit with the discomfort of not being chosen without rushing to fix it, and to let silence exist without filling it, to let distance clarify rather than threaten. And in that space, I noticed how much of my past effort had been misplaced, how often I had been trying to extract certainty from people who were not capable of offering it, how many times I had stayed engaged simply because I didn't want to feel the sting of disengagement. Letting go of that pattern felt like stepping off a treadmill I hadn't realized I was running on. I also noticed a subtle but profound change in how others related to me. When I stopped chasing, I stopped overextending. When I stopped overextending, my presence became less available and more intentional. Some people leaned in, not because I pursued them, but because they felt the shift. They met me with consistency, clarity, ease. There was no guessing, no performing, no waiting to see where I stood. Others faded out, without drama, without explanation, and instead of chasing them, I let them go. That was new. I'd always believed that letting go meant losing something valuable, but this time, it felt like releasing a weight, like making space for something that didn't require me to compromise myself to belong. I began to understand that being chosen is not the same as being valued. Being chosen can happen for many reasons: convenience, familiarity, timing. But being valued requires something deeper: presence, care, reciprocity. I stopped measuring my worth by how desirable I was to others and started measuring it by how peaceful I felt in my own life. This changed how I moved through the world. I spoke more directly. I made fewer excuses. I didn't linger in places where I felt unseen, and I trusted the absence of effort as much as I trusted attraction. I no longer chased validation. I listened for resonance. That distinction mattered, because resonance doesn't require pursuit. It doesn't need persuasion. It exists naturally, without tension. And once I experienced that kind of connection, quiet, mutual, grounded, I knew I could never go back to chasing being chosen as a substitute for being known. I stopped trying to earn my place. I started choosing where I belonged. And in doing so, I reclaimed something I hadn't realized I had given away: my authority over my own life. I was no longer waiting to be picked. I was already standing. What changed when I became unavailable? Not everything improved. That's the truth I wish someone had told me earlier. How life didn't suddenly become easier or lighter in every way. Some days felt lonelier. Some spaces grew quieter than I expected. Some connections thinned or disappeared altogether. But what changed was something far more important than comfort. Everything became clear. I stopped confusing noise with connection. I stopped mistaking familiarity for intimacy. I stopped believing that fullness came from being surrounded, contacted, needed. When I stepped back, the world didn't rush in to meet me. It rearranged itself, and in that rearrangement I could finally see what had been holding me in place. Becoming unavailable stripped away illusions I didn't know I was living inside. It showed me which relationships had been sustained by habit rather than care, which roles I had been playing out of loyalty rather than truth, which parts of my life were built on access to me, not alignment with me. This clarity was not gentle at first. It carried grief. I mourned the versions of connection I had believed in. The belief that if I gave enough, stayed long enough, softened myself enough, I would eventually be met with the same depth I offered. Letting go of that belief felt like losing something precious, even though it had been costing me quietly for years. But clarity has a way of settling in once the initial shock passes. I noticed how much lighter my inner world felt without the constant obligation to respond, without the background hum of expectation, without the pressure to maintain roles that no longer fit. The silence that once felt threatening became spacious. The absence that once felt like rejection began to feel like relief, and I didn't become detached from life. I became more present in it. My relationships changed shape. I had fewer conversations, but they mattered more. I listened without scanning for cues. I spoke without rehearsing. I let pauses exist without rushing to fill them. The people who remained met me with a steadiness I hadn't known before. There was less performance, more honesty, and there were losses. Some people drifted away when they realized I was no longer endlessly accessible. Not out of cruelty, but because the connection had depended on my availability to function. That loss hurt, but it also taught me something essential. Losing access is not the same as losing love. and losing what drains you is not the same as losing what sustains you. I stopped negotiating my boundaries. I stopped explaining my choices, not because I had nothing to say, but because I no longer needed to justify my right to exist on my own terms. I let my actions speak quietly and consistently. That consistency changed how I felt in my own body. I moved with less tension. I rested without guilt. I trusted my internal signals instead of overriding them. I stopped treating my life like an open door anyone could walk through at any time. Being unavailable didn't make me harder. It made me truer. I learned that availability is not generosity when it comes at the cost of self-respect. That kindness without discernment eventually becomes self-erasure. That peace is not maintained by constant accommodation, but by honest limits. I also learned that not everyone will understand your withdrawal. Some will interpret it as rejection, others as arrogance, a few as indifference, when you can't control that. What you can control is whether you betray yourself to correct their interpretation. I chose not to. In choosing that, I gained something I hadn't known I was missing, a sense of internal coherence. My thoughts, my actions, my boundaries began to align. I stopped feeling split between who I was and who I felt pressured to be. This alignment didn't bring applause. It brought steadiness. I stopped chasing approval. I stopped managing perceptions. I stopped adjusting myself to fit into spaces that required my silence or self-abandonment to be accepted. I trusted that what belonged to me would meet me without pursuit. And it did. Not always quickly, not always in the ways I expected, but in ways that felt grounded and mutual. Opportunities that didn't demand urgency. Relationships that didn't require me to prove my value. Moments of connection that felt easy rather than earned. I also became more selective with my own attention. I asked myself not whether I could handle something, but whether it honored me. Not whether I had the capacity, but whether I had the desire. Those questions guided me toward a life that felt less crowded and more intentional. Becoming unavailable returned me to myself. I remembered who I was before I learned to be everything to everyone. Before my worth became entangled with usefulness. Before my presence was measured by responsiveness. I didn't disappear when I stepped back. I emerged. And that emergence wasn't loud. It didn't require announcement or validation. It showed up in small, steady ways, in how I chose my time, in how I guarded my energy, and in how I trusted my inner world to guide my outer choices. I became someone I could live with. That, I've learned, is the quiet miracle of becoming unavailable. It doesn't fix your life. It reveals it. It clears the noise so you can hear what has been true all along. You are not here to be endlessly accessible. You are here to be whole. And when you stop being available for what diminishes you, everything that remains begins to make sense. I didn't change my life by becoming louder, stronger, or more impressive. I didn't reinvent myself or chase a better version of who I thought I should be. What changed everything was something far quieter and far more unsettling. I stopped being available. At first, it looked like distance. To others, it may have seemed like withdrawal, indifference, or even loss of interest. But from the inside, and it felt like coming home after a long absence. For years, I had lived outward, shaped by expectations, trained to respond, conditioned to stay open no matter the cost. My life had been defined by access. Who could reach me? Who needed me? Who relied on me to hold things together? I thought that was love. I thought that was responsibility. I thought that was maturity. What I didn't realize was how much of myself I had quietly given away in the process. My time, my energy, my inner clarity, my right to pause, my permission to not respond. I was functioning, yes, but I was functioning on borrowed parts of myself, scattered across other people's needs. The story you've just heard is not about becoming cold or distant. It's about becoming honest. It's about recognizing that availability is not the same as presence, and that constant access does not equal connection. I learned that being needed can feel like belonging, but it can also become a trap when it replaces being known. When I stepped back, I saw things I couldn't see before. I saw which relationships were mutual and which were sustained by my overextension. I saw how silence revealed more truth than explanation ever did. I saw how time, energy, and clarity returned when I stopped offering myself without discernment. And perhaps most importantly, I stopped chasing being chosen. I stopped auditioning for places that required me to shrink. I stopped proving my worth through patience and endurance. I stopped waiting for permission to take up space in my own life. That didn't make me immune to loss. Some people fell away. Some connections changed shape. But what remained was real, grounded, and aligned. The lesson in all of this is not dramatic. It's deceptively simple, and that's what makes it hard. You do not owe everyone access to you. You do not need to explain every boundary. You do not have to be endlessly available to be worthy of love, respect, or belonging. Being unavailable is not rejection. It is selection. It is choosing where your life goes instead of letting it be pulled apart by habit, guilt, or expectation. It is learning to sit with discomfort long enough to hear your own truth underneath it. So how do you apply this in your own life? You start small. You pause before responding. You notice how your body feels when you say yes. You allow a message to wait. You stop filling silence just to ease tension. You protect pieces of your day without justification. You ask yourself not, can I handle this? But does this honor me? And you let the answers guide you. Some people will understand, some won't. That's not a failure. That's clarity. This is not about fixing yourself. It's about remembering who you were before you learned to disappear for everyone else. You're not broken. You're just in the middle. Before we end, here's a simple question for you. Please answer in the comments, A or B. A. I often say yes even when I feel depleted. B. I'm learning to pause and choose more carefully. Just comment A or B below, and I'd also love to hear this from you. What part of this story felt closest to your own life? What are you noticing about your availability right now? Share your thoughts in the comments so others know they're not alone. If this story resonated with you, subscribe to the channel. And your support helps keep these quiet, honest conversations going. There's more ahead, and I'd love to continue it with you.